Welcome to WordCamp Hamilton 2015, the first talk in our first developer track. Awesome. Today I'm going to be talking about Modern WordPress Developers Toolkit. So what exactly does that mean? We're not necessarily looking at tools specifically for WordPress development. We're looking at modern tools that a lot of web developers are starting to use and how they relate to WordPress, how you can implement them when you're making your WordPress sites. So a little bit about myself. I both live and work here in Hamilton. All right. I've only been here for just over a year though, so I don't have the long history that some people do, but proud to be a part of the community. Been making websites for, I don't know, as long as I can remember, at least 15 years. Been working with WordPress for over 6 years now. I think I jumped in around WordPress 2.8. But I think one of the most important things, especially in the context of this talk, is I still get overwhelmed by all these tools that keep coming up in WordPress development. Seems like every other week there's a new cool thing to use that everybody's jumping on ship with. And I was thinking to myself, I'm just learning this other tool. And we have to be okay with that. We have to ensure that we're not focusing all of our time on learning these tools. We pick a couple tools that fit solve the problems that we're having, get to know them well, and then maybe as your career evolves, you move on to new tools. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some common developer problems. We're going to look at some tools that can help you with those problems. We're going to see how they apply to you developing WordPress sites. And most important thing, we're going to relax a little bit. We're not going to get too deep into any sort of technical code, but we're going to explore some of the concepts that these tools can bring to us. So don't get overwhelmed, relax, it's still early, I know. But let's dive into things. Let's talk about CSS. If you're developing WordPress sites, chances are you're touching CSS. Writing CSS can be fun, can be a little bit tricky. There's a lot of repetition involved with writing CSS. Let's say we're styling a sidebar, and there's a bunch of things in that sidebar that we all need to style. We're typing .sidebar h2, give it some properties. .sidebar list item, give it some properties. .sidebar p. There's a lot of repetition involved. You can end up with monstrous CSS files. Once your project gets a certain layer of complexity, you end up with these 2,000 line CSS files. And when you're adding CSS to that, it can be a struggle of finding where is the best place to put all this CSS. It can be pretty daunting. What if you need to change the color of something? I've done my site for a client. Present it to them. All right, we want to change the color of our brand from red to blue. And I have to go through my entire CSS. Sure, I could do a find and replace, but there may be related colors to that I have to go and find all the occurrences of that and change. Writing CSS can easily be a really frustrating thing. So if only there was a tool that could help us write better CSS. Sure enough, there is. Oops, sorry. CSS preprocessors. Who's heard of CSS preprocessors, sass-wise? Who uses CSS preprocessors? Good to know. So there's two kind of main CSS preprocessors. Not to say these are the only ones, but these are the two big guys on the block. Sass and less. Sass is probably the more popular option nowadays. I think a lot of the popularity with less came because Twitter Bootstrap was built using less. There's an official port of Bootstrap for Sass now, and the next version of Bootstrap is going to be written in Sass. So we'll probably see a lot more use of Sass, a little bit less. So what is a CSS preprocessor? CSS preprocessors allow you to write code that turns into CSS. So why would I use one of these things? So let's look at some of the advantages of using a CSS preprocessor. Good, we can see that. You can use variables. Variables are coming to CSS, but still a ways away yet. But let's say we have a primary brand color. papaya whip. That's a real CSS color. And we're gonna style button. And give it a background color of brand primary. Our variables in Sass are denoted with a $, similar to PHP. And so we call background color is brand primary. And that turns into, in CSS, our button, the background color is papaya whip. That's pretty cool. So you can imagine I have my huge long CSS file, and the client decides to change their brand color from papaya whip to peach puff, also another real CSS color. I only have to make that change one time in one file, and it changes the CSS throughout. That's pretty cool. Variables are used for more than just color. You can use them for sizes, font families, padding. Anything that has a value you can use as a variable. Another advantage of CSS preprocessors is functions. Functions are pretty cool. So let's go back to our button example, our papaya whip button. And let's say we want to add a cool hover effect. And it just darkens a little bit whenever you hover over it. Sass has a cool function. They have a lot of color functions. They have all kinds of functions. But let's look at one function here, the darken function. So it takes two parameters. It takes a color and how much you want to darken it. And so we write this in our Sass file, and that turns into, in CSS, does the calculation automatically for us. That's pretty cool. So you can see, again, if my client decides to change my brand color, I change brand primary, and it actually changes my darkened button color. That's pretty cool. Nesting. One of the things that I really like about CSS preprocessors. Remember that instance where I'm styling a sidebar and I have to keep typing .sidebar, .sidebar, .sidebar. Nesting removes that repetition for us. So here, we're styling our sidebar. We have our open and close brackets. And then any of the properties underneath sidebar, we can just nest in that parent item. And you can see how that compiles into what's below. Pretty cool. It takes the repetition out of writing your CSS. Imports. So no longer do we have to worry about our 1,000 line CSS file. We can break those files apart into smaller sections. So for example, we can have our reset rules in a separate file. We can have our typography CSS in a separate file. We can have our button styles in a separate file. And it makes things a lot easier, like where do I have to go to change this style? Oh, here's the file that I need to do that. And so we have our main CSS file here, and we just list our imports. Now, Adam, CSS already has imports. Why would you use this? Well, the difference is, because we're using a preprocessor, this is actually going to all spit out into one CSS file. Whereas if I'm using the CSS imports, I'm doing a request to get that original CSS file. And every import in that, I'm also having to get a separate request. So if I'm doing this with normal CSS, I'm making 5 HTTP requests. And if anybody's looking at kind of optimizing speed and whatnot, you want to have all your CSS in one file. Make sense? All right, how can I use CSS preprocessors with WordPress? Well, really anywhere that you're writing CSS, whether it's your themes, your plugins, just add that additional layer on. Make your CSS writing a lot easier. Okay, another really thing that's kind of a drag in development is there's a lot of repetitive tasks that we deal with. Let's say we're writing our CSS in Sass now, or less, and every time we make a change, we have to recompile into CSS. That's an example. Let's say we're concatenating all of our JavaScript files together. We make a change to one JavaScript file. Every time we do that, we have to concatenate our JavaScript again. Reloading a browser. Every time you make a change, hitting F5, hitting Command R. It's a real drag, and after a while, it just seems like this over and over and over again. If only there was tools available that could take all this repetition out for us. Thankfully, there are. Task runners. You may have heard these before. Grunt, Gulp. Is anybody know of Grunt and Gulp? Does anybody use Grunt and Gulp? Cool. So what these tools do is do things automatically for you. Things like, let me actually touch on the differences. Grunt was kind of the first guy around. Grunt kind of runs things in a sequential order. It does this, then it does this, it does this, then it does this. And the other thing that it does, that it differs from Gulp, is every task it runs, it reads files and it outputs files. It reads files and it outputs files. Reads files and it outputs files. Contrast that with how Gulp works. Gulp runs asynchronously, means it can do multiple tasks at the same time. You don't actually need to know any of this, I'm just giving a little bit of background information. And it uses more of a pipeline where Gulp looks at files, it does a bunch of stuff to them, and then outputs. So because it's not opening and closing files, it's a lot faster. So Gulp's the new kid on the block. Grunt still works awesome. Up to you, whichever one you want to get into. So Gulp and Grunt both run with configuration files. Let's take a quick look at a very basic configuration file for Gulp. Whenever you run a Gulp command, it's looking for a Gulp file, .js. Both of these tools are written in Node. So first thing that we need to do is include any of the tasks that we're going to be running, Gulp and Gulp Sass. Here we're going to be compiling our Sass into CSS. So we're going to create a task called build CSS. That's what we want to do. So whenever I type in my command line, Gulp build CSS, it's going to run this task for me. So it's going to look at our CSS or our Sass files and our assets SCSS folder. It's going to run it through their pipeline, run the Sass function. It's going to compile and spit it out into our CSS folder. Pretty cool. But that's not really doing anything automated for us. Whenever I type in Gulp build CSS, it'll run that. But then I have to keep typing that over and over again. And that kind of defeats the purpose of what we're doing. So that's why we look at this watch functionality. So we're going to create a task called watch. And what that's going to do is it's going to watch files. It's going to watch for changes. So I have to tell Gulp where to look for changes. So we're going to point it to that Sass directory where all my Sass files are. And then we're going to tell it to run the task build CSS. So now when I type in Gulp watch, it's going to look at my Sass files. Whenever I make a change, it's going to build my CSS for me. That's pretty cool. I don't have to worry about running the command every time I make a change. And you can quickly see how looking for files and doing things can really help out with your workflow. Some other useful tasks and things you can do with these tools. Optimizing images. Sure, Photoshop can shrink down pictures pretty well, but there's usually a little bit more file size you can take off. You can let a tool like ImageMin do that automatically for you. Add vendor prefixes to CSS, really cool. Especially if you're having to support older browsers. There's a number of properties like box shadow, transition, box sizing, that sometimes need those little dash WebKit in front of. To know what you have to include off the top of your head, that's impossible. But using a tool like AutoPrefixer, it does that for you. It looks at your CSS, it looks at the browser requirements that you give it, and it does the prefixing based on what your browser requirements are. Let's say you're writing JavaScript and you want to do some error checking. Whenever you make a change to your JavaScript, it runs JSHint, a JavaScript error checking tool. Minifying our CSS. Whenever we make changes to our CSS, crunches it down, makes the file size smaller. Uglify for JavaScript, same thing. Here's the thing I really like, auto reload your browser. Whenever I make a change, it automatically shows up in my browser. Browser Sync's a really cool tool that does that for us. So if I make a change to my CSS, it actually injects the CSS right into my browser. It doesn't even have to reload the page. If I make JavaScript changes, reloads the page automatically without me having to go back to my browser, hitting reload over and over again. Another cool feature with Browser Sync, let's say I'm developing on my desktop, I can point my phone to the same URL, and actually I can interact on my phone, and it will literally sync my browsers between my phone and my desktop. Pretty cool utility. All right, what if the command line isn't really your thing? That's okay. There's GUI applications that can help you out. If you're on OS X, Toolkit, pretty cool. Preproc is another version very similar to Toolkit that is cross-platform. And those applications can do a number of things that Gulp and Prep can do. Can compile your Sass, your less, CoffeeScript, which is a JavaScript preprocessor. Can auto-refresh your browser, similar to Browser Sync. Can run your auto prefixer, can optimize images. The difference between running a command line tool and running these, with Grunt and Gulp, you can actually save your configuration along with your project. So if I pass the project on to another developer, they have everything set up, ready to go. Whereas if I'm using CodeKit and Preproc, correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't used them, you would have to, every time a new developer starts on the project, they'd have to reconfigure that setup again. How can I use this with WordPress? If I'm doing theme development, I like the browser reloading. I like checking my JavaScript. I like writing in Sass. I can use that with plugin development as well. Depending on what I'm doing, I may want to be doing browser reloading. I may want to have our JavaScript error checking. So, next thing we want to talk about is source code issues. If you're a developer, you're writing source code issues. Especially if you're working with a second developer, you can stumble upon a lot of issues overwriting each other's changes. Let's say you're just starting up and you're working off a shared drive, and me and the other developer, make changes to the same file. One of our changes is going to be lost. There's no real easy way to roll back changes by default. Sure, I have an undo button. You can only go back so far. You're working with multiple people. There's no real easy way to do code review. Does your code get backed up? Let's say we make some changes and are going to deploy. How do I quickly know what changes I need to deploy? Getting started in code development, especially with other people, frustrating thing. Green Power Ranger feels it. Thankfully, there's Git. Who uses Git here? Awesome. If you're not using Git, I highly recommend getting started with Git. Anybody who has used it can probably say it's saved my project many times over. So, Git helps. What does it do? Lets you work in branches. So let's say we have our main project code. I can make a copy of that code. I can make some changes. Once I'm done with those changes, I can merge my code back into the project. Kind of keeps those flows of change separated. I can easily see the changes throughout the entire history of the project. I can go commit by commit and see this person changed this at this time, this person changed this person changed this. Even on a file by file basis. Something weird's happening with this file. Let's see the history of that file and go through, see what happened. I can easily roll back changes. Oh no, I did something that completely crashed my program. Let's go back to this point in history. One command. Combine that with some Git repo hosting services, such as GitHub and Bitbucket, and your power of Git is a lot better. Both great hosting solutions. You can have free accounts for both of them. GitHub, their pricing structure, their free pricing structure doesn't allow you to have private repositories, so all of your source code has to be open source unless you pay. Bitbucket, their pricing structure is a little bit different. You can have private code hosting. I think they are by number of developers in the team. So if you have a large number of developers, you have to pay for that for Bitbucket. Both great tools, both have their own awesome features. So what do you get with actually these hosting services? Issue tracking. You can create issues, you can have discussions on those issues, you can close issues. Code review, especially if you're working on training a newer developer. Anytime they make changes and are ready to push their code into your project stream, you can actually go through all the changes that they've made. You can make comments. You can go through the code together and say, hey, maybe there's a better way to do this, or this doesn't quite work. Great way to communicate and be collaborative about your code. It's a way to back up your code easily. It's now on your system and another system. Not into the command line. Git by default is a command line utility. Don't worry, there are a number of GUIs available. GitHub has an application for Windows and OS X. Not sure if it's Linux available. The company behind Bitbucket, Atlassian, has an application for source tree, OS X and Windows platform. Git Tower is a really popular one. That's an OS X only. So if command line scares you, you can still use one of these applications.
Tortoise.
Tortoise is another one?
Yeah, Tortoise works really well.
If you're working in a team, one of the real important things with Git is establishing a workflow. Working the same way all the time. If you're looking for a workflow to get started, I recommend looking up something called Git Flow. A really great workflow. It's been around for a long time, tried and tested. It's created by a guy named Vincent Dreisen. There's a link there. I will make my slides available. They're actually online now. I'll post the link a little bit later. All right, so how can I use this with WordPress? I can use it with my theme development. I can use it in plugin development. And my entire site can actually be tracked in WordPress. So that kind of brings us to an interesting segue. Now that we're tracking our entire WordPress site, there's a lot of other people's code involved with a WordPress project. Things like plugins, WordPress core, front-end libraries. Let's say we're using Bootstrap for our theme, or Foundation. Let's say we're using some development tools like Grunt and Gulp. There can be a lot of files that go into this project. But those files are maintained by other people. Why do we have to maintain them as well? Can lead to some bloated Git repositories. It can be a pain to get specific versions. Like let's say I need this one specific version of this plugin. Kind of a pain in the neck to go out and download that specific version. It can be a hassle to update everything. Wouldn't it be great if there was tools that could help solve these problems with other people's code? Sure enough, there is, and they're called package managers. So a package manager kind of, think of it as a phone book. You have directories of other people's code, and what we want to do is give these managers some instructions on what pieces of code to go get. For PHP, the common package manager is called Composer. For your front-end tools, things like Foundation, Bootstrap, even things like jQuery, Bower can help you out. For Node, NPM, things like Grunt and Gulp, those things run on Node. Rather than installing the actual Node application, the Grunt application in your repository, just save the instructions on getting those applications. So all three of these package managers work very similarly, so I'm not going to go through each one in detail, but I'll give you an idea of how they basically work. So let's start off with Composer, which is a PHP framework. Here's an example of a configuration file. So we give our project a name, and here's where the magic really happens, the requirements. Here are the packages and the versions that we want to include in our project. Composer has a registry called Packagist, and there's a layer on top of Packagist called wPackagist that actually clones the entire WordPress repository and makes it available through Composer. So anytime there's a plugin that you want, you can list it in your composer.json file, and whenever you run Composer install, it's going to automatically install all these plugins and those specific versions that you want. Now you'll see the versions have a 3.1 star. That means it's going to get the latest patch release for that. So maybe unless I'm testing minor and major releases, I only want to get the patched release. So that's going to get the latest patch release of all those plugins. We have some extra configuration, where to install our plugins, where to install WordPress. And sorry, our last line here, John P. Block, who I believe works for 10up, made a composer-friendly version of the entire WordPress core. So you can install that by Composer. So how do I use Composer? If I have a composer.json file, I just type in composer install. So if I had that configuration saved with my project to get a new person going, and not have all that code stuck in my repository, they just have to run composer install. Let's say I want to update my plugins or core. Composer update will get the latest versions of those plugins, depending on what's in my composer.json file. So how can I use Composer in WordPress? To manage WordPress core, to manage WordPress plugins. Let's say we're using some other PHP libraries like PHP Unit. We can have that managed as well. Bower for front-end tooling. Things like Bootstrap, Foundation, same thing. We have a bower.json file. We list the requirements that we want. So let's say we're adding CSS frameworks to our theme. We can add JavaScript libraries for our plugins. Have a bower.json file, bower install. We get all those requirements automatically. Pretty cool. NPM is the node package manager. If we're using Grunt and Gulp, we want to be able to install that stuff in our project. NPM install looks for a package.json file and installs those tools automatically for us. Can also do things like compiling our Sass and less files, some of these task runner-based things. All right, another issue that's very common amongst developers, environments. Especially if you're working with multiple developers, you can have a variety of operating systems involved. Somebody could be running Linux, somebody could be running Windows, somebody could be running OS X. Broken dependencies. Let's say I have Node on my system, but my co-developer doesn't. That can be a headache. Slow setup times. Anytime I bring a new developer on, it takes me a while to get them set up. Go through MAMP, set up the domain, set up the database, and then there's everybody's favorite. But it works on my machine. It's always good to have your development environment as close to your production environment as well. If only there was a tool that could help us with this. Vagrant. So what Vagrant does is it creates and configures virtual development environments. Uses technology like virtual machines, and it kind of has everything that you need for your development platform in this one configuration. So how Vagrant works is it looks at a set of instructions and goes out and downloads and sets up your virtual machine for you. If you're interested in learning more about Vagrant, I'm not going to get too detailed into it. 11:30, Paul's doing a how to set up a Vagrant development system, going through Vagrant a lot more in detail than I will. I've seen the talk before, at least a similar talk from Paul, and a lot of great info in there. So I recommend if you're interested in Vagrant to check that out. That being said, a few benefits of using Vagrant. Why would I use Vagrant? Sounds like another headache. You can have consistent environments. If you're working with multiple developers, that's a great thing. If you want your development environment to be as close to your production environment as possible, there's a great reason to use it. You're going to have consistent dependencies. You're going to have the software that you need bundled in this virtual machine. You don't have to worry about, oh, my machine doesn't have that tool. Rapid setup. If you have these configuration files set up and you have Vagrant installed on your system, setting up this virtual machine is as simple as typing Vagrant up, and your machine goes and does its thing. Automation as well. Whenever you start up a Vagrant image, you can have it do certain things. So let's say the first time that you spin up a Vagrant image, it actually installs WordPress for you. It sets up your database. It does all these things that you may need to do that you used to do manually. You can have it set up. So it takes that manual tasking over for you. Some common Vagrant WordPress images. Vagrant Press Varying Vagrants, which I believe is a 10-up tool. Mercury, which WP Engine has done. There's another open source project called Bedrock Ansible. Paul has me beat here. He has a few other WordPress images as well. Stick around for his talk. Or you can roll your own. There's a cool website called Puppet that it's a point and click. I want to set up this version of Linux. I want to set up Apache. I want to set up this. Point and click, and it spits out a configuration file for you. It takes all that work out of manually configuring things for you. Why would I want to roll my own? Why wouldn't I use one of these pre-existing images? Maybe I want my Vagrant image to be exactly like my production environment. I want to use that. So we've talked about a lot of problems. We've talked about a lot of tools and trying to solve those problems. If you're new to these tools, this could have been really overwhelming for you. But just remember, relax. What can I do to move forward? My suggestion, one thing. Take one thing from this talk. Take one problem that you commonly have. Pick one of the tools that I suggested. Learn a little bit more about it. Try introducing it to your workflow. At first, it's gonna suck. There's gonna be hurdles. Some of these things are more complex than others, but that's okay. That's how we all start. First time I stumbled upon any of these, I'm like, oh, this is a headache. But a few weeks later, a few months later, I can't develop without these tools. It makes my development so much quicker. I'm so glad I put that time in up front. So it's okay to fail. It's okay to be overwhelmed. But start with one thing. Because after a while, you get comfortable. It's like, yeah, I'm rocking this stuff. And then you learn a new tool and you start over again. Frustration again. But the key to everything is you want to spend more time on development than on actual dealing with development issues. So if that means adding some new tools to your toolkit to smooth out some of those things, so be it. That's it for me today. I'm running short on time. My slides are posted online. You can check them out there. Follow me on Twitter. Yes, I do tweet about heavy metal once in a while. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed the talk. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, you've got about 20 minutes.
20 minutes?
Yeah, because the next one's up.
All right.
Yeah.
Get fancy.
Any questions? If there's any specifics on any of the tools you want to chat about afterwards, I'll be around. Nick in the back.
Yeah, great talk.
Thank you.
Let's get an overview of all the great tooling out there. I have a question for you about version control though.
Sure.
And your assets that are being compiled.
Sure.
And do you check those in your repo or not? What do you do?
So the question is, let's say I'm using Sass to compile into CSS. Do I take those compiled CSS files and check them into my source control? I do not. I only keep the pre-compiled stuff in my repository. I'm still exploring workflow onto how to best manage that. We do have our production environments that do have the tools that does allow us to compile those things on our production and development servers. So the problem with checking in compiled CSS into your project, there's no guarantee that that is the most up-to-date version of CSS. Maybe we made a change to our Sass file. We didn't compile it and check that compiled code. So there's a risk of having that compiled code not be the most up-to-date. So we take those compiled stuff out of our repo. Make sense? Cool. Sure.
What are the major differences between Sass and Less?
There's not a ton of differences. I mean, variables have a $sign versus an @ if you know one, you can easily hop into the other. When you get into more complex things, like some of the functionality might be a little bit different. Some of the functions, some of the mix-ins might be different. SAS also has an extra library called Compass that's available that has kind of beefs that up. Less doesn't really have that. But for 95% of the usability, it's just some syntax differences. There's very little difference. I can easily jump between the two, and aside from changing my @ to $signs, I can read both.
Okay, you kind of alluded to the fact that less might be on the way out, or did I over-analyze that?
SAS, if you look around, you see a lot more blog posts and tutorials about SAS than less. I don't know of many projects that use less aside from Bootstrap, and because Bootstrap is moving towards less, I just think we'll see a lot more less.
Moving towards SAS? you mean?
Sorry, SAS,
Okay.
yes. Bootstrap will be moving towards SAS.
So it would be beneficial, like right now I use less, but I
Mhm.
mean, it's mostly the same, so it should be an easy transition.
Yeah. Would I say switch over just because? Unless you have a reason to switch, keep writing less. You're not going to see a lot of huge advantages, depending on how deep you're going into using less. So,
Okay, thanks.
if I were to say you're starting from scratch and pick one, I would point you towards SAS. That kind of clarifies things.
Yep.
So you mentioned Compass. What can you tell us about Compass?
Not much, because I don't use it.
Okay.
There's a website that has a ton of documentation that you can find out more about it. But I'm sorry, I can't.
Fair enough.
I can't help you out. Back there.
First off, thank you. I both enjoyed and learned a lot from your talk.
Thank you.
I imagine that in working with teams, as you mentioned, these tools make that process easier. But I gotta imagine folks come to a team with different levels. Perhaps some folks, certainly not as up to speed as you.
Mhm.
How do you deal with that? How do you sort of bring folks up and say, look at the benefits, but I get that you're not, maybe up to speed on a pre-process or something else. How do you deal with those issues?
Great question. We actually deal with this at my current workplace because we have some people in support who aren't as familiar with these tools because they're not working with us while developing with these. Coaching is the big thing. Teaching, spending time and sitting with them and taking the time to walk through the process and spending time in coaching. It's really what it comes down to. Make sure everybody from your company is on the same page with how you develop, because every team is different.
Thank you.
One challenge I've found is when you're launching a website that might have a well-developed SEO, are there any tools that you can use to help that transition so that if URLs need to change, redirects are easily set up, or any other processes that might help that transition?
So in terms of you have an existing site, you're launching a new site, there's some URL changes. I've done a little bit of that, usually just with the WordPress plugin. There's a few that can help out with that. I don't know of any I don't use any sort of more server-side tools to manage that. I've kind of just gone the easy way, throw a WordPress plugin. I don't know of any names off the top of my head. I think something like Quick Redirect or something. That's the only experience I've had with that.
What do you do when you inherit a project that is not using a preprocessor like SAS and you want to bring it up to your standard? Is there any methodology or are there any tools that you can use that will take a standard CSS file and break it down?
Well, I haven't actually explored that, but I mean, you can take CSS and throw that in a SAS file and there'll be no problems. Because really SAS is CSS plus some other stuff. So if you want to start gradually adding on, you could throw the existing CSS into a SAS file. You could start, maybe taking that apart, breaking it into some different pieces. It all depends on how big of an inheritance, like how much work am I going to be doing? Is it going to be worth my time? Am I just updating a few CSS rules, or am I building this into a bigger system? So depending on how much work I have to do will depend on how much I'm going to do. Because adding a large number of tools can take some time. But usually I'll just do little piece by little piece based on the problems that I see. So I mean, if I have a huge CSS file, one of the things that I want to do is throw in some Sass, kind of just start breaking things, but I'm not going to rewrite that entire CSS. It wouldn't make sense in a time, in a sense.
So in that situation, would Sass insert like new code that you're putting in a particular place in the CSS file, or would it just do it at the top or bottom? Or
In terms of,
like that example where you're like sucking in a existing CSS file and adding to it later.
so depending on how I have it, how I have my Sass structured, let's say I put everything into one Sass file, it's just going to output things in the order that it's written in. Unless there's some mix-in stuff, or sorry, some media query stuff, then it kind of groups that together. But it doesn't really mess with the order, or it doesn't do any changes to existing CSS. So it'll just output it directly unless I make any specific changes to it. Any other questions? Yes.
I know you say all these tools can help us to develop the WordPress theme. So can you give us a very brief example how to use these all skills to create a WordPress theme from the start to the end?
How to create a WordPress theme?
WordPress theme, yeah, use all these tools.
Great,
from the
that's
start to the end.
a really great question. The starting point I use that has a lot of these tools already built in, there's one called Sage, which is done by a group under the name Roots. It's a starting theme that starts off, currently it starts off with Bootstrap, and you have Gulp that does a lot of the task running that we talked about today. So usually if I'm starting a theme from scratch, I'm using this theme called Sage, and that has a lot of my workflow built in. You can combine that with some of the existing WordPress and Vagrant images. And then how I have it set up, I have a kind of starting point project that has my Vagrant configuration and some instructions on setting up the environment. So I have my starter theme that I've customized, has my specific Vagrant image, has my composer.json file in that goes out, downloads the plugins that I commonly use, downloads WordPress, gets my theme, sets that up for me, and then I can start development. I don't have that open sourced right now. I can check and see see if there's any information that I shouldn't have in there and open source that. But I mean, it's going to be no different than a lot of other starting points out there. The same organization that is behind Sage, they also have kind of a WordPress platform that you can use called Bedrock. And on top of that, they have a Vagrant image to go along with that whole thing called Bedrock Ansible. So my suggestion is go to roots.io. There's a ton to read there, and all their stuff is open source. Some great developers working on those projects. Good? Awesome. Yes.
So you mentioned a bunch of plugins that you normally use as your base.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be willing to go over that list?
Just a couple, Akismet, the anti-spam one, WordPress SEO, advanced custom fields I find myself using on most sites, WP Migrate DB Pro. I haven't talked about databases at all. There's not a best way to do that. There's a lot of different solutions. The way that we do it is just use the WP Migrate DB Pro, which allows you to pull and push databases from server to server. Really handy. We use that on most of our projects. I think those are the main ones that I use on every project. Yes?
Is there anything that's repetitive that you still have to do? Like plugin configurations after you set up, getting plugins from different repositories that aren't?
So in terms of repetitive tools repetitive things that fall outside of the immediate scope, so installing WordPress on the initial setting up of Vagrant, I'm starting to use WP-CLI, the command line tool, to set that up automatically for us. Along with WP-CLI, you can activate plugins. One of my next steps is also see if I can configure some of the plugins that I always have to configure at the start. Something like setting up my license key for WP Migrate DB Pro, I have to do that every single time. It's a bit of a pain. So I'm not there yet, but WP CLI is going to help me do a lot more of those repetitive tasks out there. Things like plugin configuration, I'd love to see if WP CLI can do that. I don't know. I haven't had enough time to look into that yet. So. Trying to think if there's anything else.
What about plugins that aren't readily
that aren't
accessible?
available on
Can you
the
create your own repository, or?
Yeah, so in composer.json, there's a way to look at private repositories, download locations that aren't through the normal WordPress thing, and that's just a configuration thing. You can say, download this plugin from this location. It's on GitHub. It's on, here's the download link for it. WP Migrate DB Pro, we pull in. We have a download link that they provide. It includes our license key in it, so obviously can't make that available. But yeah, you can configure things outside of the normal WPackagist WordPress repository. So definitely ways to do it. Cool. Any other questions? Oh, one more.
I'm still pretty new to it, but
Sure.
for hosting WordPress sites, are there any hosts that are way better than others for accommodating all of this?
That's an entire talk in itself. It all depends on what you need, what your budget is, and how much work you want to do versus how much work you want the hosting company to do. You can go with the cheap $5 hosts. You can go with $30 a month for something like a WP engine. Honestly, you get what you pay for. I've had great experiences with WP engine. I've had some good experiences with the cheap hosting. So it's a huge subject. It's one of the most common WordPress questions. But the real answer is it depends. Depends what you need, what your client needs. Oh, my computer went to sleep.
Oh.
It's okay. Sure.
What kind of computer resources do you give your vagrant niche typically? Like, what do you find works best for you?
Not a ton. I'd have to look up to see what it is, but it's not a ton of resources. There's a new kind of virtualization thing called Docker that a lot of people are jumping on. It's supposed to use a lot less resources. I just don't think it's, at least in the WordPress world, it's mature. Also, I don't know much about it. Some other guys at our company are looking into using Docker, so I'm just going to wait for them to learn it and then pick it up from that. But in terms of resources, that's one of the arguments against Vagrant. It's a little resource heavy because you're working on a complete virtualized system. But yeah, I'd have to look up to see what resources I use.
A couple of gigs maybe will be.
Yeah. Paul will go into a ton of detail in his talk, I'm sure. Right, Paul?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
And I do the same Docker recommendation as well.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for paying attention.